Thanks very much, Kate, for your kind introduction. I'm delighted and excited to speak to you about what I describe as the most fabulous project of my career. You'll hear more about that shortly. Look, I too want to give an acknowledgement of country, because today we're on the Whadjuk Noongar Boodja, and we acknowledge and respect their spiritual relationship to country. So this is a picture from Royal Perth Hospital Emergency Department, where illicit drug-related presentations represents about 7% of our workload. Illicit drug use is a global public health problem, and the associated harms are increasing. Now, the conventional approach to treating illicit drug intoxications in the emergency department is really just based all around their symptoms and self-report, what the patient tells us they've taken. But self-report is unreliable because the drug market is unregulated. And one of our EDNA chief investigators in Victoria, from his work, he's reported that if you rely on self-report, you will be wrong 85% of the time. Now, for most of my career, it just simply hasn't been possible to get objective data on what these drugs are. And that's due to the expense and resources and the very sophisticated equipment and expertise required in a forensic laboratory. Hospital laboratories can't do this type of analysis. And throughout my career, whenever I've tried to publish on this subject and I submit it to a medical journal, the peer reviewers always say, but what's your analytic confirmation, which I've never been able to provide. Now, for some doctors, knowing what these specific drugs are, they say won't help them treating the patient in front of them. But I believe it has the potential to impact future treatment and to influence clinical guidelines. And it's also really important to get the objective data so you have accurate statistics on what drugs are actually causing harm. So, if we're not looking for the right drug or not using the right testing procedures, then our data is all skewed and you're making decisions on skewed data. And that ultimately can impact clinician confidence in dealing with the unknown. So, for me, this project is best exemplified in a famous quote by Victor Hugo, who said, "Nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time has come." And the background to this project was the subject of an article in this magazine, Your ED, and I'm sort of going to go through today some of the background to the project and also provide you with some up-to-date results, one of them from an hour ago. So a lot of the new drugs are called NPSs, novel psychoactive substances. And there's a specific formal definition of that, which I'll read out to you. It refers to a new narcotic or psychotropic drug. So psychotropic means it acts on the brain in pure form or in preparation that is not controlled by United Nations conventions and may pose a public health threat comparable to that by substances that are listed on those conventions. So everybody's probably heard of heroin, which is a traditional illicit drug. So a novel psychoactive drug might try to mimic the effects of heroin, but it's produced in a lab, for example. The United Nations says there's one new NPS reported every week, and you may be aware that multiple deaths in Australia have been attributed to NPSs. So now I'm going to go through a bit of a timeline. So I was working clinically in the emergency department at Royal Perth in the 1990s, and one evening a young person came in very unwell, having taken a blue Mitsubishi pill. And there's nowhere you can find out any information on what's a blue Mitsubishi. So remember, this is the 1990s and the internet was kind of just starting. I'm not even sure if we had the internet then at work, and certainly no smartphones. You can't find out what's a blue Mitsubishi. Anyway, an hour or two later, another young person came in, also very unwell, who'd taken a red Mitsubishi. And as is human psychology, we all thought, oh no, like the red Mitsubishi's got to be worse than the blue Mitsubishi. But it kind of always stuck with me, well, you've got people taking these drugs, well, what's in them? Can't find out. So then fast forward to about 2013, where we had what we call the Night of the Blue Pills. So this was New Year's Eve 2013, and one of my colleagues, David McCutcheon, was working the night shift that night, and they had a cluster of 10 patients coming to the emergency department through the night who'd taken blue pills. And it was a blue pill that had a lightning strike icon on them. And they came in extremely unwell. Some of them had been in sort of terrible circumstances. One person had climbed 11 metres off a light tower and fallen down. Somebody was terrified because there was a crocodile chasing after them. They were very unwell. Some of them wound up in the intensive care unit. And David very cleverly took blood samples, well, had blood samples taken from all of them, and eventually they were sent to Chem Centre, which is our state's forensic laboratory. And well, we didn't know then what we didn't know, but like they were wasted samples because there's a very specific sampling and storage process required for illicit drugs. So a lot of these drugs are very unstable at room temperature. So basically you have to take it and freeze it right away. And so we didn't know what we didn't know. And we learnt a lot. And we wrote it up in the Medical Journal of Australia, as you saw in the previous slide. And reiterating the point, there's little reliable information to inform us. And all the storage and sampling procedures is very specific. So moving along the timeline, around about 2016. So around this time, because we'd sort of developed a bit of a relationship with the Chem Centre, they basically funded our WISE study, which, as you can see, there's the WA Illicit Substance Evaluation Study. And I've got the Royal Perth Foundation logo on there because they co-funded this study, so thanks very much, Kate. And this was really a pilot or proof of concept study to work out, well, can we actually do this, collect samples correctly, procedures, sending it to the Chem Centre, etc. And a couple of years later, there was the methamphetamine task force, and they were very impressed with the WISE study and recommended that it be ongoing, although it did actually finish in 2018. But as a result of the WISE study, we were able to formulate specific clinical guidelines and procedures for dealing with these patients. And this clinical guideline was endorsed as best practice because it makes sense that you actually find out what people are taking. So now we're almost at 2019, and the National Centre for Clinical Research on Emerging Drugs was established, and NCRED, as it's called, was a direct result from the 2015 Prime Ministerial National ICE Task Force, which, amongst many of its recommendations, concluded that, hey, we need more objective data, which, as you'll remember, I first worked out in the 1990s. But anyway, NCRED was established and they had funding for research. We applied for funding for EDNA, because EDNA is sort of like EDNA on steroids, kind of. And fortunately, we got some funding, which allowed us the option to grow the project. We also did some more research. And the main thing I want to highlight is this bottom one here, that the thing that doctors have the least confidence about is managing an overdose where you don't know what the substance is. And again, that's totally understandable. And then a few other organisations came on board. So East Metropolitan Health Service Mental Health Research Fund was established for 1 year, and we successfully obtained a grant from them for EDNA. The Mental Health Commission was very keen on it, and they provided us with some co-funding along with the WA Department of Health. And so where we are at today would not have been possible without that really important funding, despite the fact, and on the next slide, it'll be on the next slide, in 2020, as Kate said, I'm very pleased to say we got the biggest NHMRC Ideas grant in the country. So even though it was the biggest grant in the country that year, they still gave us a 15% haircut, as they often do. But that's where that other funding that we got from those other organisations made a really big difference, because that kind of bridged the gap and allowed us to do what we wanted to do. I also want to point out that 2/3 of that money just goes to the labs to do the analysis. That's where the bulk of the funding goes, because it's really high-level, expert, sophisticated equipment. So toxicosurveillance is a big word. It's kind of like a monitoring system, and there's 3 main aims to EDNA. So the first aim is kind of a laboratory aim. So is to get all the state forensic laboratories talking to each other so they develop a common scope of analysing these samples. The second aim is a clinical aim, so is to understand what drugs people are taking, what are the clinical features that go with that, and some of those outcomes that go with that. And the third aim is what I call the public health aim, because it's important to have some early warning system in place, and also to inform public health and harm reduction policies. So we've got the states involved. WA is the lead state, so this is a WA-led project. And there's one main Sentinel Hospital ED in each state. In WA, it's Royal Perth Hospital ED, not surprisingly. And in each state, the Sentinel Hospital can recruit other emergency departments in that state to be part of the network. One of the things I've learnt about this project is that Australia is a federation of states, and each state likes to do its own thing its own way. So that's created its own challenges, but that's a really big learning point. So the 5 hospitals in WA are Royal Perth, as I mentioned, Fiona Stanley, Rockingham, Armidale and Bunbury hospitals. I'm not going to go into this slide in detail, because really it summarises in a sense some of the things I've already mentioned. As a result of the WISE project and the early years of EDNA, we've developed our own processes to get all the data and collect the samples and do everything, and to communicate findings. And it's all in the EDNA clinical registry, which is hosted at Curtin University, because they meet the international standards for hosting data. There's very specific requirements, and they meet the highest level of standards around the world. So who gets into EDNA? So this is what I call the SUC criteria. So if you come in with a severe illicit drug intoxication, and we've got some definitions for severe. If it's an unusual illicit drug intoxication, so an unusual one might be if somebody says, well, I've taken a sleepy drug, but they're behaving like a stimulant drug, or vice versa. That's obviously unusual. Or they're part of a suspected cluster of poisonings. And the classic thing would be like a music festival. You've probably seen in the news every now and then there's a cluster of poisonings that emanate from music festivals. We've got a few exclusions there. The one I'm going to highlight is the second dot point. So, which is if the doctors think it's predominantly methamphetamine, like we don't need more cases. We got hundreds of cases in the WISE study. We don't need any more. So now I'm going to go to the dashboard. So I've just got to change over a little bit. So this is the live dashboard. But before I sort of navigate you through the dashboard, I do want to point out there are some additional benefits for sites who are involved in EDNA because it enhances the clinical care of patients. Most doctors actually lack the specific expertise required to diagnose very specific toxicology syndromes, especially when they're complicated by emerging drugs, unknown drugs, and associated mental health problems. So having that objective data provided by a timely analysis, and when it's needed, we can get the results back in 24 to 36 hours, depending on the situation. It allows very individualised and tailored treatment for that patient beyond that standard generic approach that I mentioned at the start. And this includes things like diagnosis, treatment, how long they might stay in hospital. So now we're going to go to the dashboard. And so you can see that, maybe I'll use this. So we've got about 3,500 cases in the registry now. And median age 33, typical time in ED is just under 5 hours. You can see the cases contributed by each state. Now, each state did not start, we didn't all start on the same day. It was a staggered start, and because WA led the project, we started the first. So that's why we've contributed the most cases. You can see South Australia's been a really big contributor. And there are some differences in the way each state does things, which also influences how many each state has contributed. New South Wales, we keep crossing our fingers and hopefully they'll start this year. The Australasian Triage score is really just an indication of severity when they arrive at hospital. And not surprisingly, most cases are in the very more severe end of the spectrum. Sex distribution is roughly 2/3 male, 1/3 female, and where people use, mainly in their residence or in some public place. And again, as you can see, I think it's 85% arrived by ambulance, which again reflects severity. Then if we go to the next page. All right, top 15 drugs. I'm not going to read them all out, but you can see the big two are methamphetamine and GHB. And just remember, harking back to the point, we're not actually chasing meth in this study, and yet it's still the number one that we're picking up. GHB, or gamma hydroxybutyrate, is often known as the date rape drug. It's a central nervous system depressant, but a lot of people take it voluntarily because it's a pro-sexual drug. There are a number of drugs there that you can see that are coloured in orange, and they're the NPSs, the novel psychoactive substances. That's on the next page, which I'll get to. So you can scan through that. The general pattern there is roughly what I went through before. All right, NPSs, novel psychoactive substances. So this represents about 9% of all the cases in the registry. Again, I'm not going to read out all those names, and as you can work out, some of the names can be hard to pronounce. The most common ones there, those top four, are what are called novel benzodiazepines. So most people are probably familiar with benzodiazepines. The classic one that people know is Valium. It's a central nervous system depressant. So the thing about the novel benzodiazepines, well, first of all, they're illicit, unregulated. They still cause central nervous system depression, but the effects are unpredictable and unknown compared with pharmaceutical benzos. there's a few other drugs there. There's the nitazines. We've been taking some nitazines, which I will mention a bit more in a moment. So you can see the median age is a bit younger. Remember, overall was 33. That's down to 27. Roughly 3/4 male. Tend to spend a bit longer in the ED. So next page. This is a live dashboard. It's updated 5 times a day. However, it's unvalidated data. Some data's missing. Sometimes the data changes. So you can't rely on this for definitive answers. Now, the researchers have a private dashboard, which I'm not allowed to share with you, which you can drill down into more detail and is more validated. But I'm sure Courtney would say this is 99% close, yeah? So what happens to these patients? So for people who've taken the traditional illicit drugs, you can see 1 in 5 wind up in the intensive care unit. You can see here. And then if you go to the NPSs, 1 in 4 wind up in the intensive care unit. And as you can see, it's predominantly those novel benzodiazepines. Yes, there are other drugs as well, but they're the biggest group. And then, you don't need to see that, so we're going to go back to the PowerPoint. So that's an old picture that's up there. Okay, so what are some of the highlights and how this research is being translated really almost in real time? So there's the nitazine group of drugs. So nitazines are a synthetic opioid. So the classic illicit opioid would be heroin. Now, the nitazines are very many times stronger than heroin, probably hundreds of times stronger than heroin. And we've picked them up in a range of states. Some of you may be aware there's been a bit of media profile on the nitazines in the last few weeks. That's because there's been quite a big cluster of nitazine poisonings over east in a short space of time. In WA, we've only had 3 cases detected in EDNA, and the last one was August last year. So at this stage hasn't been an issue in WA. And it's also important to remember that even though the media hypes up the new stuff, the big ones are still number 1 heroin, and then number 2 are the pharmaceutical opioids that get abused. Now, just 1 hour ago, we got an email from our colleagues in South Australia, and they've just detected another nitazine case. So somebody bought an oxycodone tablet on the street. So 1 tablet, obviously took it, stopped breathing, got taken to their emergency department, and were resuscitated, and it's all good. But that's another, it just sort of shows how they've done it, they've got the result, we know the result, and they're going to issue a public health alert. So that's the way the system should be working, because, well, we don't want people to die when it's not necessary. And being informed is actually really helpful. Now, acute thebaine poisonings. Now, to be honest, I'd never heard of thebaine before 2022. But in those 4 states there was a cluster of poisonings on people who had bought poppy seeds to make a poppy seed tea. And people buy the poppy seeds to make a poppy seed tea because it contains opium, and some people like to take opium. Unfortunately, the food chain had been contaminated with thebaine, which arises in non-food grade poppy seeds. and it caused some severe problems, including seizures and cardiac arrest. And thebaine is considered to be a bit like strychnine. It's a really bad poison. So when that kind of event happened in the past, it would take weeks, if not longer, to complete the investigation, find out what's happening, inform the authorities, etc. Perhaps partly by good fortune, a lot of these patients came to the emergency departments who are part of the EDNA network. Blood samples were taken in a very short space of time. We knew what it was. Gets reported to Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, and 1 week after that, they do their work in doing a national recall. That's really impressive, and that's how the system should work. GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate, which I mentioned previously. One of the most interesting things we're finding is that there's a lot of methamphetamine co-detected in people who are using GHB. And we don't know why, but some of my co-investigators have come up with a hypothesis that when people are high on meth and they're wanting to come down, they use the GHB, which is a sleepy drug, to help them come down off the meth. I think it's a very plausible hypothesis, very hard to prove, of course, but that's something that we've learnt. And just going back to that WISE study, which was from 2016 to 2018, the co-detection rate was only 10%. So the patterns of usage change. Novel benzos, well, I've already spoken about that, so I don't need to repeat that. We hold national steering committee meetings, which I chair. I always have to psych myself up because often there's this big screen with 30 plus people like all around the country, and I've got to manage the agenda all within 1 hour. I do want to highlight Jen Smith, who's our national coordinator and senior research fellow, Courtney Webber, who's our national database manager, and Ellie Kotsis, who's our research assistant, who are here. And one of the secrets to success of EDNA is the incredibly talented team that we have to help make all these things happen. I should also mention Jess Soderstrom, who's our clinical toxicologist. So what are the benefits of the registry? So there's a thing called the Prompt Response Network, which has been established by the NCRED, the National Centre for Clinical Research on Emerging Drugs. And they've formed this website called The Know, and it's theknow.org.au if you're interested. And basically what it does, it's a national information sharing network to promote rapid sharing of alerts and to promote public health responses. Because that's really an online community platform with data there for consumers, for the public, for health professionals. It's really good. And obviously the EDNA samples provide incredibly important objective data that they can use. They also use data from other sources, of course. And they put it all together to enable accessible information across the country, because all of these issues cross state borders. You know, what happens in one state, there's a good chance it's going to happen in another state. So any state-generated alert ends up on there, so it's available nationally. And that sort of means that more Australians can be informed about the potential harms of emerging drugs. So that's really the sort of the early warning system. We can inform government policy. This is some of our WA clinical alerts that we send out to clinicians and emergency departments. And these are just some of the examples of some of the drug alerts that have been generated by EDNA samples. So that's a WA one about those poppy seeds. This one's from Queensland about a fake Xanax, which is a There's this one where the nitazene was present in methamphetamine. The EDNA team produces a quarterly newsletter, typically highlighting one of the new drugs. So that's just an example of one of the newsletters, clonazepam. All right, if you want to get the newsletters, you can either email us or you can scan our QR code and ask to join in. I'm not going to labour over these, but obviously we've produced some scientific papers that have been published in the medical journals. The one on the right in particular was from last year, where we published the WA results from EDNA. And it leads me to highlight that a lot of people use multiple illicit drugs, which actually makes analysis and understanding the issues harder. So in the WA data, 28% of people had more than one illicit drug in their sample. And this picture, which is one I took, so these were all the drugs that were on a patient that I treated quite a few years ago. So that's marijuana, that's cocaine, that's an MDMA-like drug, that's methamphetamine, and this one was a Viagra-like drug. But polydrug use is common, and we're still kind of grappling with how to do some of the analyses when you've got multiple things of different amounts and you don't know what time they were taken, and you're trying to understand the clinical effects. So as you can see on the timeline, we're now at 2024. And I'm pleased to say that we've now developed a bit of a relationship with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and we've made Australia's first national contribution to their NPS data program, which is a global program. And that really strengthens Australia's contribution to global surveillance network. So that's a really notable achievement from this year. So doing surveillance of emergency department presentations with analytic confirmation of drugs is vitally important in detecting and identifying those new and emerging drugs in the community to inform our harm reduction strategies. EDNA is actually a very unique source of information on the drugs that are causing harm in the community by virtue of the fact that they're winding up in the emergency department. I've found that this project has had incredible engagement from multiple agencies and people at many levels. It gets everyone talking and sharing information with the goal of harm reduction by using objective data. Now, when we present some of this at public forums, the most common feedback we get is this. You mean you're not doing that already? People can't believe that it's taken this long to get to this point. But now we are. The challenge ahead is to ensure continuity of this essential and unique data source. And I just want to finish up by acknowledging the many organisations that are a part of this project and have been wonderful contributors to what we've done, and which really reflects that research is very much a team sport. You cannot do it as an individual, all right? Research is a team sport. So thank you very much, and I'm obviously happy to take any questions. I don't know who was first, we'll ask you.
The time spent in emergency by parties suffering from newer drugs is longer than the conventional drugs, and they've got a higher presentation rate to ICU. that a reflection of the dangers of those drugs, or is it a reflection of the difficulty of the clinical staff coming to grips with a different presentation?
I think it's more the first thing. I think some of these newer drugs are really potent compared to some of the more traditional illicit drugs. So they're simply stronger and the effects are more severe. It's also worth, you've sort of reminded me also to highlight, sort of separate to that, I read recently that 86% of the world's opium supply comes from Afghanistan. And if you read the news, apparently the Taliban have banned the production of opium. All right, so there's going to be a global shortage of opium, which is going to drive more the production of synthetic opioids. And that's, a lot of these people are concerned about that. And it's, again, reflects the importance of having some kind of early warning system to identify that and try and mitigate it as much as possible. I think.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
With a number of states opening up to drug checking, or pill testing as commonly termed, I'm just curious to know how EDNA integrates some of that stats and what your position is around Western Australia opening up to these types of programs.
Sure.
Hopefully get to a point where we understand the drug before they end up in emergency.
Sure, yeah. So, and I will answer the question. So obviously there's a bit of separation between the two because this is after they've come to ED. The idea of a drug checking service, or pill testing as it's commonly called, is to hopefully prevent that in the first place. And as a general rule, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And you've alluded to the fact that there is now a pill testing service in Canberra. Victoria's just announced. Queensland, I think, has started theirs. And New South Wales has got a pilot coming, I think. And the evidence from around the world with these pill testing services, which have been present in European countries and other countries probably for at least 20 years, is it actually tends to decrease drug use and reduce harms. And of course has the benefits that it's an opportunity for professional counsellors or people who know about drugs to interact with a group of users who they wouldn't ordinarily interact with. So, and most, from all that data around the world, if a user finds out, hey, that pill contains something that I've been told is really dangerous or whatever, like most of them either don't take it or they take a much reduced dose, which is sensible and safe. And you know, there was a big cluster of music festival poisonings in Melbourne and Sydney in the summer, just gone. And look, none of those young people went to the music festival. I'm going to take this pill and I hope I wind up critically ill in the intensive care unit. Nobody goes to a music festival for that purpose. Now, in all these pill testing services, they always emphasise the safest option is to not take the drug, which is true. That is the safest option. But the reality is we know a bit over 40% of Australians have ever used an illicit drug. So we kind of have to be pragmatic. And there have been multiple organisations who are supportive of some kind of drug checking service. So the college that I'm in, and I'm sort of speaking now with my college hat on, Australasian College for Emergency Medicine, they have a people-focused harm reduction policy that is supportive of drug checking services, but also the College of Physicians and the College of Psychiatrists supports it. The Australian Medical Association, the New South Wales coroner has recommended it, the Victorian coroner has recommended it. And it is good to see that it's slowly happening over east, but just made sense to me.
Yeah. Sorry, just a quick follow-up as
Sure.
well. With alcohol and other drugs, stigmatisation continues to be a large barrier for consumers accessing support and treatment. I'm just curious if EDNA has emphasised or looked at stigmatisation to support emergency departments to be more accommodating and supportive for individuals presenting. Wondering if that's factored into the work that
So not explicitly like that. I know people appreciate having objective data. I think a part of the problem with the stigmatisation is the media tends to be very stigmatising in the way they deal with these stories. And probably one of the very first EDNA stories was like, in the media, like I just shook my head in disbelief. So that's a really hard battle. The emergency department, a lot of patients in the emergency department are marginalised and vulnerable. And so we sort of deal with stigma every day. I did give some evidence to the New South Wales Special Commission of Inquiry into the drug ice, and they asked about stigma. The problem is when your whole life or a large part of your life you felt in your inner being that you're just stigmatised all the time, that when you go to a health professional who's totally professional, noble, trauma-informed, trying to do everything right, unfortunately, that can still get perceived by the person who's just so used to stigma as more stigma. So that's a really difficult battle to win.
Has fentanyl arrived here yet? I understand it's used in Europe, so I read somewhere.
I haven't, Courtney, can you tell us? Sorry to put you on the spot. I think there's some cases.
There's some recreational cases of fentanyl overseas. There's not much here, but pretty much all of our fentanyl cases are used from management in the ED. There's no actual recreational use. So there's not much to put on
Yes.
yet.
But, sorry, I'll ask you one more question. And if somebody came in with a genuine needed intensive care, like someone after a bad car accident or heart attack, are they given priority over these people taking, I mean, say you've got a full intensive care, there's only so many people you can take there. I just wondered.
So all patients are prioritised according to their need. So it's not like a time of arrival thing, it's based on priority. And if you've got two, what I'd call category 1 patients, so somebody's critically injured, like in a car crash, and someone who's critically ill from a drug problem, you know, they will both get seen immediately. There's no differentiation.
So many beds in intensive care, you said that a lot end up in intensive care, so that sort of blocks.
So if somebody needs intensive care and our intensive care unit is full, they find somewhere else another intensive care and they get transferred to another intensive care in the city.
Yeah. And no one's studying why they're taking the drugs in the first place. I mean, they're not all stigmatised.
Sure, yeah.
You know, if you go to a music festival, you're not going for the music then. Not like the old days.
I will say a few words in relation to that, and I'm looking at Jen, who probably knows more about this than me, but there is a spectrum of drug use. So I think a part of the stigma is it's all, I don't know, addicted people, whatever. But there's a whole spectrum of drug use. So in the emergency department, I'm sure we mostly see the more severe end, and that might be 10 to 15% of users, and it's the same with alcohol use. You know, there's about 10 to 15% of people have real problems with alcohol, and then there's a whole bunch of people who don't, and then there's some people who don't drink alcohol at all. And it's the same with illicit drugs. So yes, there are some people who use a lot and it's a problem and causes issues, and then there's people who use a handful of times a year, and there's people who might use it only once or twice in their life, and then there's people who never use it. So it's not an easy question to answer, but I don't know if Jen wants to say anything in relation to that.
I think the data that we capture in the literacy department setting is only used of one lens, and so there is a lot of other information sources that are needed to understand the drug users, attitudes, intentions, behaviour over time. So I think, yeah, it's important to highlight that there is one piece of the jigsaw puzzle in terms of drug surveillance. So you need to, and we're very interested in terms of partnering with other agencies agencies at the moment to look at intentions around GHB and meth use, just to try and unpick, chicken and egg with what's being used, why and how.
I think you had a question?
I didn't catch the fifth hospital site in WA about Royal Brook, Bunbury, Rockingham, and from my understanding, what was the fifth one?
Armadale?
Ah,
Yeah.
okay, that was it.
Yep.
Just in terms of the statistics you were quoting, where you said 7% of admissions into emergency, is there any, which tended to surprise me in the sense that I thought that was quite a low figure. In that figure of 7%, do you have any idea how many are readmissions? So they're people who consistently, pushed to the point of danger. And also, just out of interest, what are the other 93%? What are they in emergency?
What? Everything else? Oh, look, so we get a lot of people with chest pain. Is it a heart attack? That's sort of 7 to 10%. We get a lot of people with injury. Injury is like a really big component. Medical illnesses, mental health problems, lots of things.
So any sense of whether that 7% is sort of growing or decreasing or remaining stable? It's a sort of a...
So we've been doing an annual audit of that number for the last, I think the first one was 2019. And look, basically it's just bobbling around 7%. Having been in the system for 40 years, I would say to you, I'm noticing that it's definitely up from the 80s and 90s, but I can't give you like specific numbers, but my impression is it's going up. All right. How many of those 7% are repeat attenders? I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I don't know. Might have the data in some detail somewhere.
I'm just curious, two things. One, the increase in meth and GHB. Obviously I think that's changed a lot over the last number of years. And then obviously you also said that self-reporting was about 85% incorrect at the time. Has that changed obviously with the research that you're doing, has that changed how you treat patients coming into the hospital?
So, the fundamental thing is if people need to be resuscitated, there's like a standard approach that's used. So it's not changing how we do it, but when we've got the objective information, all right, and they're still sick, we can use that information to guide treatment, for example.
Do you get the results quickly?
So when we ask for it quickly, we can get it within 24 to 36 hours.
All right.
So just by way of example, a few years ago, there was a cluster of young people who came in from a nightclub who were very unwell from taking ecstasy, what was called ecstasy. And there was another young person who had a seizure in the same location, who came in around about the same time as all the others. And we know too much ecstasy causes seizures, so everybody thought that she was part of the cluster. The samples were turned around in 28 hours, I think, and all of them had MDMA in them, but that girl had 0. So it turned out she just happened to arrive at the same time, and that completely changed her treatment in the intensive care unit. So that's just one example of having the information actually does make a difference sometimes.
Daniel, this is so fascinating. I'd like to know, do you have any future aspirations for EDNA? What's next?
Well, obviously, because it's strictly speaking a research project, even though we're already translating the research into practice, it's a time-limited and funding-limited project which finishes at the end of next year, although we might be extending it to 2026. And but we're working on the Commonwealth and state governments to keep it going on. So yes, a part of my research role is advocacy to keep the project going. But so far, our presentations have been very positively received. Oh, more questions. Jen? And this is not a Dorothy Dixer.
If I don't bring it up, I guess in relation to a couple of the comments with, the proportion of ED patients that are alcohol or drug affected, do you have any comments around the limitations with ICD coding
Yeah, that's a good question. So all patients are coded, and there's the ICD, International Classification of Disease coding system. Basically, it's useless, in my opinion, for detecting this because they're behind the times, and like all those novel psychoactive substances, they're not even in that classification system, but it's the system we're stuck with. So when you see, in a sense, official reports from organisations that have looked at, say, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data, which is based on ICD-10 coding, all right, we know that it underreports the issue probably by about 50% as a rough, broad brush figure. So all those official stats totally underreports the issue. I don't know how to fix the ICD system.
Is alcohol still the biggie?
Sure. So in our ED, our most recent data is about 11% of all of our presentations are alcohol related. And there is a little bit of an overlap with the illicit drugs, but not that much, not that much. Yes?
Is there any prospect of bringing the analytical procedures from the CAM centre into the ED, or is the hospital to reduce the turnaround times?
That would be fantastic, but isn't cheap or easy, and like it's so highly specialised. Has the CAM centre even got enough like expert forensic toxicologists to do it? It's a really, I think it's a limited resource. Great idea, but to actually achieve it, we're a long way away from it.
Thank you, Daniel. Fabulous questions from everyone. That was just so interesting. I'm sure you all enjoyed that. So please join me in thanking Daniel.
Thank you.